Just after 2 a.m. on a storm-lashed forgotten highway, my headlights cut through the deluge, revealing a figure no sane person should have been standing there. Every instinct screamed, "Drive past," but something made me stop. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that feels personal. Each drop seemed to be targeting my windshield with a vengeance, and the wipers, even on their frantic, highest setting, could barely keep up. It was just after 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was on the loneliest stretch of Route 7, a two-lane blacktop that cuts through miles of dense, unforgiving forest. The only signs of life were the ancient, moss-covered trees that crowded the road, their branches like skeletal fingers in the brief, strobing flashes of lightning. My name is Mark. I'm 27, and my world had shrunk to the glowing dashboard of my beat-up sedan, the rhythmic thwump-thwump of the wipers, and the hiss of my tires on the soaked asphalt. I'd been driving for 6 hours straight, making the trip back from my mom's place. She wasn't doing well, and the visit had left a hollow ache in my chest. All I wanted was my own bed, a dry towel, and about 12 hours of dreamless sleep. My eyes burned with fatigue, and I was running on the dregs of gas station coffee and sheer willpower. It's a dangerous combination on a night like this. Your mind starts playing tricks on you. The shadows between the trees start to look like crouching figures, and every glint of light on the road becomes a pair of animal eyes. That's why, when my headlights first sliced through the deluge and illuminated a solitary figure standing by the side of the road, my first thought was that I was hallucinating. It was just a trick of the light, a particularly tree-shaped shadow. But then lightning split the sky, and for a full, brilliant second, the world was cast in stark black and white, and he was still there. A man standing ramrod straight, thumb half-heartedly stuck out. He wasn't waving, wasn't trying to flag me down with any sense of urgency. He was just there, a static part of the storm. My foot instinctively eased off the accelerator. Every horror movie, every true crime podcast, every piece of common sense I'd ever absorbed screamed at me to keep going. Don't stop. Never stop for a hitchhiker, especially not in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, in a storm that felt like the end of the world. Who would be out here? What sane person would be standing in this downpour, miles from the nearest town? But then my headlights caught him again, and I saw the way he was drenched. His clothes, what looked like an old army-style jacket and jeans, were plastered to his frame. Water streamed from his short-cropped hair and down his face in rivulets. He looked impossibly thin, almost gaunt, and he was shivering. I could see the tremors running through his body, even from 30 feet away. He wasn't a monster from a horror movie. He was just a poor soul caught in a bad situation. My mom's voice echoed in my head, the gentle chiding she'd give me whenever I was being too cynical. A little kindness costs you nothing, Mark. Against my better judgment, I pulled over. The car slowed with a groan, tires crunching on the gravel shoulder about 20 feet past him. I watched him in my rearview mirror. He didn't run towards the car. He just walked, a slow, deliberate pace, his boots splashing in the deep puddles. It was unnerving. I clicked the automatic lock button, then immediately felt foolish and unlocked it again. What was I going to do? Make him stand out there and plead? The passenger door opened, letting in a gust of wind and the roar of the rain. A wave of cold, damp air flooded the car, carrying the scent of wet earth and ozone. He slid into the seat without a word, pulling the heavy door shut behind him. The sudden silence, with the storm now muffled outside the car, was deafening. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, water dripping from him and forming a dark puddle on my floor mat. "Rough night to be out," I said, trying to break the tension. My voice sounded unnaturally loud. He turned his head slowly to look at me. His face was pale and angular, all sharp cheekbones and a strong jaw. He looked to be around my age, maybe a little older, but his eyes looked ancient. They were a pale, washed-out blue, and they held a weariness that went bone deep. "You could say that," he replied. His voice was raspy and low, like gravel being stirred in water. I put the car back in drive and carefully merged back onto the empty road. "Where are you headed?" "East," he said. "Just that. Not a town, not a landmark, just a direction." "All right. East it is. I can take you as far as Millwater. It's about 40 miles up." "That'll do," he said, and turned to look back out the window, as if the conversation was over. The awkwardness was thick enough to chew. Here I was, playing the Good Samaritan, and my passenger was about as talkative as a rock. I tried again. "Name's Mark." He hesitated for a moment before answering. "John." We drove in silence for the next few minutes. The only sounds were the storm and the hum of the engine. I glanced over at him a few times. He hadn't moved a muscle. He was just sitting perfectly still, hands resting on his knees, his gaze fixed on the dark, rain-streaked world outside. The car's heater was blasting, but I could feel a strange chill radiating from his side of the car. Around his neck, I caught the glint of metal, a thin chain, with a pair of dog tags tucked into the collar of his drenched jacket. Military, I figured. That explained the posture and the jacket. "You in the service?" I asked, nodding towards his chest. He didn't look at me. "Was." His tone was flat, final. It was a clear signal to drop it. Message received. I cranked up the radio, hoping some music would fill the void, but all I could find was static. We drove on. 10 minutes passed. 15. The rain started to let up slightly, turning from a biblical flood into a mere torrential downpour. I was starting to relax a little. Maybe he was just a quiet guy, shell-shocked from the cold and the rain. My act of kindness hadn't resulted in me being axed to death. Go me. I was just starting to think about what I'd say when we got to Millwater when it happened. Out of the darkness, a shape materialized in my headlights. It was huge, brown, and moving fast. A massive buck, its antlers like a crown of thorns, had bolted from the woods directly into our path. Instinct took over. I yelled, a short, sharp curse, and slammed on the brakes. The tires screeched in protest, losing their grip on the slick pavement. I yanked the wheel to the left, trying to avoid the collision. The car fishtailed violently, the back end swinging out. For a heart-stopping second, I was sure we were going to spin out and hit a tree. I fought the skid, turning the wheel back to the right, my knuckles white, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The buck, startled by the noise and the swerving lights, leaped at the last second and vanished back into the forest. The car straightened out, coming to a shuddering halt in the middle of the empty highway. The engine had stalled. For a moment, I just sat there, hands frozen on the wheel, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The only sound was the ticking of the cooling engine and the drumming of the rain on the roof. "Holy crap," I breathed, my voice trembling. "Did you see that?" That was close." I turned to my passenger. "My good deed for the night, John." "You okay?" The passenger seat was empty. My brain refused to process what I was seeing. He was gone. The door was still closed. The lock was still down. I hadn't heard a thing over the screech of the tires. It was impossible. He was right there. I blinked, expecting him to reappear. He didn't. All that was left was a damp patch on the upholstery, and the puddle of water on the floor mat, and something else. There, glinting in the faint light from the dashboard, lying perfectly centered on the passenger seat, was the pair of dog tags. The chain was looped neatly, as if it had been placed there with care. My hand shook as I reached over and picked them up. They were cold, unnaturally so, the metal like a shard of ice against my skin. I held them up to the light, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. There were 2 thin metal plates. On the top one, stamped in neat capital letters, was a name, a serial number, and a blood type. The name stamped into the cold metal wasn't John. And the second I read it, a cold that had nothing to do with the storm, settled deep in my bones because I recognized the name. I'd seen it just this morning, etched on a weathered headstone in the cemetery behind my mom's church. My fingers were numb, partly from the car's lingering chill, partly from the sheer, adrenaline-fueled terror that had seized my entire nervous system. SGT, David Haskins. The name was stamped so clearly, so permanently, into the metal. I hadn't just glanced at the headstone earlier today. I had stopped. I was visiting my dad's grave, a ritual I performed every time I came home. On my way out, I'd noticed a newer stone, just a few rows over. It was simple, military-issue gray granite. It looked out of place among the older, weather-beaten monuments. The name on it was David Haskins. I remembered thinking it was sad, wondering what his story was. I didn't check the dates. Why would I? It was just a name. A dead man's name. A name I was now holding in the palm of my hand. My first coherent thought was to get the hell out of there. I fumbled with the keys, my hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to fit the key back into the ignition. The engine turned over with a splutter and a roar, the sound momentarily drowning out the frantic drumming of my heart. I slammed the car into drive, my foot pressing the accelerator harder than I intended. The tires spun on the wet asphalt before catching, and the car lurched forward, speeding down the dark, empty road. My eyes kept darting to the passenger seat. It was still empty, of course, but it didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. A heavy, cold presence lingered there. I could almost see the impression his body had left on the seat cushion. I could smell the rain and the damp earth he'd brought in with him. I flicked my gaze to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see his pale, weary eyes staring back at me from the back seat. The road behind me was just an endless black ribbon, disappearing into the storm. Did I imagine it all? Was I so sleep-deprived that I had hallucinated a passenger? A whole conversation? But the dog tags in my hand were cold, hard, and undeniably real. They were heavy, a physical anchor to a memory that defied all logic. He had been in my car, and now he wasn't. The 40-mile drive to Millwater felt like an eternity. Every shadow cast by the trees looked like a man standing by the side of the road. Every pair of reflecting road signs became a pair of watching eyes. I gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles ached. I kept the dog tags in my right hand, my fingers clenched around them, the edges of the metal plates digging into my skin. I didn't want to let them go. I was terrified of what might happen if I did. Finally, the lonely darkness began to recede, broken by the distant hazy glow of civilization. Millwater. It wasn't much of a town, just a small cluster of buildings huddled around a crossroads, but tonight it looked like the promised land. I saw the familiar buzzing neon sign of a 24-hour diner, the Corner Cup, and pulled into the mostly empty parking lot without a second thought. I parked right under a flickering street lamp, the brightest spot I could find. I cut the engine and just sat there for a full minute, the silence of the car now a comfort rather than a threat. I stumbled out of the car, the cool night air hitting my face. The rain had eased to a persistent drizzle. Inside the diner, a lone waitress was wiping down the counter, a pot of coffee steaming behind her. The place smelled of stale grease and bleach, the most reassuring scent in the world right then. I slid into a booth by the window where I could keep an eye on my car. The waitress, a tired-looking woman with kind eyes, came over. "Coffee?" she asked. "Yes, please." "Black," I managed to say, my voice still hoarse. As she poured the steaming black liquid into a thick ceramic mug, I laid the dog tags on the table. They clinked softly against the formica. The name stared up at me. SGT, David Haskins. I had to know. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling as I typed the name into the search bar, adding Millwater to narrow it down. The Wi-Fi was slow, the little wheel spinning for an agonizingly long time. I took a scalding gulp of coffee, the heat doing little to chase away the chill that had settled in my bones. Finally, the results loaded. The first hit was a local newspaper archive. The headline, dated almost exactly 10 years ago, hit me like a physical blow. "Local soldier killed in tragic Route 7 accident." My blood ran cold. I clicked the link, my hands trembling so much I almost dropped the phone. The article was short, accompanied by a grainy black-and-white photo of a young man in uniform. He was smiling, his eyes bright and full of life. It was him. It was the man from my car, John, but younger, before the weariness had settled into his features like a permanent mask. It was Sergeant David Haskins. I read the article, my eyes scanning the words, each sentence tightening the knot of dread in my stomach. He had been 27 years old, home on leave. He was driving back to his parents' house in Millwater during a severe thunderstorm when his car went off the road near Miller's Bridge on Route 7, the very road I had just been on. The article mentioned treacherous conditions, poor visibility. They said he'd likely swerved to avoid a deer. A deer. The word leaped off the page. The same thing had just happened to me. I scrolled down, my heart pounding in my ears. The final paragraph was the worst. "Due to the storm and the difficult terrain," it read, "search and rescue teams were unable to locate Sergeant Haskins' body, which was believed to have been thrown from the vehicle upon impact. He is presumed dead. A memorial service will be held on Saturday." He was never found. His body was still out there, somewhere in that dark, unforgiving forest along Route 7. He hadn't been going east to Millwater, he'd been heading for the crash site, his own unofficial grave. He wasn't just a hitchhiker, he was a ghost, trapped, replaying the last moments of his life. And tonight, on the 10th anniversary of his death, he had gotten into my car. I dropped my phone on the table and leaned back in the booth, my head spinning. It was too much. The vanishing act, the name, the headstone, the deer, the accident report. It all swirled together into a single, terrifying truth. I had picked up a ghost. My gaze drifted from the phone to the window, to my own reflection staring back at me from the dark glass. I looked pale, haunted. and in that moment I realized something. He hadn't just vanished. He had left the dog tags for a reason. It wasn't a mistake. It was a message, a plea. He wanted me to do something. But what? Find his remains? Give his family closure? A wave of nausea rolled over me. This was insane. I was just a guy driving home. I wasn't a ghost hunter or a detective. I should just leave the tags with the police, tell them some crazy story they'd never believe, and drive away. Forget this ever happened. I stared at my reflection, trying to force myself to believe that was an option. But as I looked into my own panicked eyes in the glass, something in the reflection shifted. Behind me, in the reflection of the empty booth, a figure started to resolve out of the darkness. It was faint, translucent, like smoke. It was the hitchhiker. He was sitting there, his pale blue eyes fixed on me in the glass. I spun around in my seat, my heart seizing in my chest. The booth behind me was empty. There was no one there. I whipped my head back to the window. The reflection was still there. The ghostly image of Sergeant Haskins hadn't moved. He was staring at me, his expression not threatening, but filled with an intense, desperate sorrow. And then, slowly, he raised a hand. He wasn't pointing at me. He was pointing through me, out the window, back toward the darkness from which I had just fled. Back toward Route 7. The reflection of Sergeant Haskins hung in the glass, a shimmering, silent accusation. His outstretched hand, pointing back towards the forest, was a command I couldn't misinterpret. My breath hitched in my throat. This wasn't a choice anymore. I couldn't just walk away from this, file it under weird things that happen on lonely highways, and go back to my life. I was involved. He had chosen me, for whatever reason, and left a piece of himself in my care. The waitress came back over, coffee pot in hand. "Another?" she asked, her voice pulling me from my trance. I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because her friendly expression faltered, replaced by one of concern. "Honey, you all right? You're white as a sheet." I tore my eyes from the window and looked at her, then down at the dog tags on the table. "Yeah," I lied, my voice cracking. "Just long drive." She glanced at the tags but didn't comment. "Well, you get some rest. Holler if you need anything." She retreated behind the counter, leaving me alone with my impossible decision. I knew what I had to do. The thought of driving back into that stormy darkness, back to the spot where a man had died 10 years ago, sent a cascade of icy dread through me. But the image of his sad, pleading eyes in the reflection was more powerful than the fear. He wasn't a monster. He was just lost. And he thought I could help him. I paid for my coffee, leaving a $10 bill on the table, and walked out of the diner's warm fluorescent safety. The drizzle had stopped, but the air was still heavy and thick with the smell of wet pine. The street lamp above my car sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows. As I slid back into the driver's seat, the cold spot on the passenger side seemed to have intensified. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I drove out of Millwater, the dog tags clutched tight in my left hand, resting on the steering wheel. I was heading west now, back the way I came, back towards Miller's Bridge. My phone's GPS told me I was about 15 miles away. The newspaper article had mentioned the bridge specifically. It was an old, single-lane iron structure that spanned a deep ravine, a notorious spot for accidents, even on a clear day. The drive back was different. The fear was still there, a constant hum beneath the surface, but it was accompanied by a strange sense of purpose. I wasn't just running from something anymore. I was heading towards it. I scanned the sides of the road, looking for any sign, any landmark from my near miss with the deer. The forest was an impenetrable wall of black on either side. After what felt like an hour, my headlights picked out the rusted iron latticework of Miller's Bridge up ahead. My heart started to pound again. This was it. I slowed the car to a crawl, my eyes sweeping the road for the spot where I'd swerved. 100 yards before the bridge, I saw it. The faint dark lines of my tire skids were still visible on the wet asphalt. I pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder, the exact same spot where I'd stopped to pick him up, though I was on the opposite side of the road now. I killed the engine. The silence that descended was absolute, broken only by the drip of water from the trees and the distant rush of the creek below the bridge. I sat there for a long moment, building up my courage. What was I even looking for? A 10-year-old crash site? There'd be nothing left. But his ghost had pointed. He had led me here. I grabbed the powerful flashlight from my glove compartment, took a deep breath, and opened the door. The air outside was cold and damp. The ground was soft and muddy under my feet. I stood by my car, the flashlight beam cutting a sharp, white cone through the darkness. I pointed it towards the spot where the deer had emerged. The woods were thick, a tangle of underbrush, ferns, and towering pines. There was a steep embankment that dropped off from the shoulder of the road down into the ravine. This is insane, Mark. A voice in my head, the rational part of my brain, was screaming at me to get back in the car, but I couldn't. I held up the dog tags. They felt strangely warm now, a faint thrum of energy pulsing from them, or maybe it was just my own racing pulse vibrating through my hand. "Okay, Sergeant," I whispered into the darkness. "Okay, David, I'm here. Show me." As if in answer, a gust of wind rustled through the canopy above, shaking loose a shower of cold raindrops. I took it as a sign. I carefully made my way to the edge of the embankment, my shoes slipping in the mud. I played the flashlight beam down the steep, wooded slope. It was a treacherous drop, at least 30 or 40 feet down to where the ground leveled out before the creek. I swept the light back and forth from the road down into the thicket. I saw nothing but trees, rocks, and mud. What did I expect? A giant blinking arrow? Frustration and doubt began to creep in. Maybe I was crazy. Maybe I'd had some kind of waking dream, a stress-induced hallucination. Then I saw it. It wasn't much, but it was something. About halfway down the slope, tangled in the roots of a massive oak tree, was a small glint of color. It was a flash of faded, rusty red, almost completely swallowed by the green and brown of the forest floor. My heart leapt. I had to get a closer look. I dug the heels of my sneakers into the soft earth and began to crab walk down the embankment, using tree trunks and exposed roots as handholds. The ground was slick and unstable. Twice my feet slid out from under me, and I had to catch myself to keep from tumbling headfirst down into the ravine. Finally, I reached the spot. I knelt down, my jeans soaking through with mud and wet leaves, and aimed the flashlight at the object. It was a piece of metal, twisted and mangled, the red paint peeling and blistered with age. It was a car door, or what was left of one. I swept the beam around the immediate area. A few feet away, I found a shattered piece of a headlight, then a shred of tire, half buried in the soil. This was it. This was the crash site, hidden from the road, swallowed by the forest over a decade. Adrenaline surged through me. He was here. His body had to be somewhere nearby. The newspaper said he was likely thrown from the vehicle. I stood up and began a slow, methodical search, my flashlight beam cutting grid patterns through the undergrowth. "David," I called out softly, feeling foolish. "I'm trying to help." The only reply was the chirping of crickets and the gurgle of the creek. I pushed deeper into the woods, away from the wreckage, my light bouncing off the wet leaves. The ravine floor was a chaotic mess of fallen logs and moss-covered boulders. It was impossible terrain. He could be anywhere. After 20 minutes of searching, my hope began to fade. The area was too vast, the darkness too complete. I was just one guy with a flashlight. How could I possibly find him? Defeated, I started to make my way back towards the wreckage. Maybe I should just call the police in the morning, tell them I found the crash site of a decade-old accident. They could bring in a proper search team. As I passed the gnarled oak tree where the car door was wedged, my foot snagged on something. I stumbled, catching myself on the tree trunk. I pointed the light down at my feet to see what I'd tripped over. It was a root, thick and black, snaking across the forest floor. But there was something else. Lying next to the root, half covered by a thick blanket of moss, was a single, mud-caked object. It was an old leather boot, the kind a soldier would wear. My breath caught in my throat. I knelt down, my hand shaking as I reached out and brushed away the moss. The boot was still laced up, and it wasn't empty. My fingers brushed against the unmistakable solid shape of a human ankle bone inside. A wave of vertigo washed over me. I scrambled back, my flashlight beam shaking wildly. I had found him, or at least part of him. My light followed the ground up from the boot. He was tangled in the massive root system of the old oak, his body half buried by 10 years of soil and fallen leaves. Most of him was just a skeleton, reclaimed by the forest, but parts of his uniform were still intact. I had found Sergeant David Haskins. Relief and horror warred within me. I had done it. I had found him. His family could finally have closure. He could finally rest. As I stood there, catching my breath, a new sound cut through the night. It wasn't the wind or the creek. It was a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness just beyond the edge of my flashlight beam. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I slowly raised the flashlight, sweeping the beam into the trees from where the sound had come. 2 points of light flared back at me. Eyes. They were low to the ground, and they were bright green in the beam. It was a wild animal, probably drawn by my scent or the light. A coyote, maybe. Or a bobcat. The growl came again, louder this time, filled with a terrifying menace. It was a deep, chesty sound that didn't belong to any coyote I'd ever heard. And then the creature stepped forward, into the full glare of my light. It wasn't a coyote. It wasn't a bobcat. It was a massive, snarling dog, its fur a matted, dark brindle. Its lips were pulled back, revealing a terrifying set of yellowed teeth, and a thick line of saliva dripped from its jaws. Around its neck was a heavy chain-link collar. But that wasn't the most terrifying part. Its eyes. They weren't just reflecting the light. They were glowing with their own faint, malevolent green luminescence. And as it took another slow, deliberate step towards me, I realized it wasn't guarding the remains of Sergeant Haskins. It was guarding me from leaving them. My blood turned to ice. The dog, if that's what it was, looked like something straight out of a nightmare. It was big, powerfully built like a pit bull or a Rottweiler, but leaner, hungrier. Its fur was patchy and caked with mud, and a long, ugly scar ran from its eye down to its snarling muzzle. But the eyes were what paralyzed me. That sickly green glow wasn't a trick of the light. It was an internal, hellish fire. This was no ordinary stray. It took another step forward, the growl turning into a low, rumbling snarl that vibrated in my chest. I was trapped. The steep, slippery embankment was behind me, and this thing was in front of me, standing between me and the safety of the road. I had nothing to defend myself with but a flashlight. My mind raced, desperately searching for an out. I slowly backed away, my feet sinking into the soft earth. "Easy there," I whispered, my voice a pathetic, trembling thing. "Good dog." The creature responded with a sharp, vicious bark that echoed through the ravine. It wasn't buying it. It lowered its head, its powerful shoulders bunching as if preparing to charge. This was it. I was going to die out here, mauled to death in the same forgotten spot as the soldier I'd come to find. A grim, ironic symmetry. In my left hand I was still clutching the dog tags. As I took another step back, my knuckles brushed against the cold metal. SGT, David Haskins. The name seemed to pulse with a sudden warmth. An idea, born of sheer desperation, flashed in my mind. It was insane, a total shot in the dark, but it was the only shot I had. I held up the dog tags, letting them dangle from my fingers in the beam of my flashlight. The metal glinted in the darkness. "Is this who you're looking for?" I asked the beast, my voice shaking. "Is this who you're protecting?" The dog stopped advancing. Its snarling quieted slightly, replaced by a confused whine. Its glowing eyes flickered from my face down to the tags, then back again. It cocked its head. Its ears perked. "David Haskins," I said, reading the name aloud, my voice gaining a sliver of confidence. "I'm a friend. He sent me. He wants to go home." The creature let out another whine, this one softer, almost mournful. The terrifying aggression in its posture seemed to melt away, replaced by something else. A profound sadness. The green glow in its eyes softened, dimmed. It took a hesitant step forward, not with menace but with caution. It lowered its head and nudged the dangling dog tags with its wet nose, then looked up at me, its expression now one of pleading. It was his dog. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. This creature, this spectral guardian, had been his. It had been with him in the crash, and it had stayed here for 10 long years, a loyal, ghostly sentinel, watching over its master's final resting place, waiting. I slowly knelt down, never breaking eye contact. "It's okay," I said softly. "It's time to go home now. Both of you." The dog sat down on its haunches, its tail giving a single, tentative thump against the wet leaves. The last of the tension drained out of me, replaced by a wave of exhaustion and sorrow so deep it was almost suffocating. I had found them both. With the Guardian's silent permission, I used my phone to mark the exact GPS coordinates of the site. I took a few pictures of the wreckage and the skeletal remains tangled in the roots, grim evidence for a story no one would believe. Then I turned to the dog. "Come on, boy," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Let's go." I started the difficult climb back up the embankment. When I glanced back, the dog was gone. The space where it had been sitting was empty. For a heart-stopping second, I thought it had vanished. But then I saw him. Not the dog, but the man. The translucent, shimmering form of Sergeant David Haskins stood beside the old oak tree, his hand resting on the spot where his remains lay. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the dog, who now stood beside him, equally translucent, its ethereal tail wagging. The hitchhiker finally had his companion back. He looked over at me, and for the first time I saw the ghost of a smile on his face. He raised a hand, not in a plea, but in a salute, a gesture of thanks. Then he and the dog slowly faded, like smoke in the morning mist, until there was nothing left but the dark, silent forest. The next morning I walked into the Millwater Sheriff's Department, looking like I'd wrestled a bear and lost. I was covered in mud, my face was scratched, and I hadn't slept in nearly 40 hours. I placed the dog tags and my phone on the desk of a skeptical-looking deputy. I told him a heavily edited version of the story. I said I was an amateur history buff interested in local cold cases, that I'd read about the Haskins accident, and that I'd gone looking for the crash site on a hunch. I told him I'd nearly hit a deer in the storm, and my car had skidded to a stop right by the embankment where I found the wreckage. I left out the parts about the hitchhiker, the glowing eyes, and the ghostly salute. Some things you just keep for yourself. At first they didn't believe me, but the GPS coordinates were exact, the photos were undeniable, and the dog tags were the final, irrefutable proof. An older officer remembered the case. He remembered the Haskins family, their unfathomable grief, and the open wound of not being able to bring their son home. 2 days later, they brought him home. A full honor guard was present as the forensics team carefully recovered the remains of Sergeant David Haskins. They found the rusted chain-link collar of his dog, named Buster, tangled in the wreckage nearby. His parents, now elderly and frail, were there. I watched from a distance as an officer approached them and solemnly handed them the dog tags I had found. The look of pained, tearful relief on his mother's face is something I will never forget. They finally had their son back. They could finally lay him to rest. A week later, I attended the funeral. I stood at the back of the small crowd gathered at the cemetery, just another anonymous face. They buried Sergeant David Haskins with full military honors, in the plot next to his father, who had passed away a few years after the accident. The headstone I had seen was no longer just a memorial. It was now a true marker. As the final salute was fired and the flag was folded, I felt a sense of peace settle over the place, a sense of completion. Before I left town, I drove back out to Route 7 one last time. It was a clear, sunny afternoon. In the daylight, the spot by Miller's Bridge looked ordinary, just a curve in the road bordered by trees. There was no sign of the wreckage, no lingering chill in the air. It was just a place. The ghosts were gone. They were finally at peace. Driving home, I felt different. The hollow ache in my chest from my mom's illness felt a little less empty. The world felt a little less cynical. I'd been given a glimpse behind the veil, a terrifying and beautiful reminder that there are ties that not even death can break, loyalty, duty, and the desperate human need to find your way home. I still don't know why he chose me that night. Maybe it was just random chance. Or maybe, in my own state of grief and exhaustion, I was just open enough to see a soul who was more lost than I was. Whatever the reason, I'll never drive a lonely road in a storm the same way again. And I'll always be listening for the quiet plea of someone just trying to get home.